I take refuge in Buddha. I take refuge in Dharma. I take refuge in Sangha. Let me start with asking you a question. Do you find that you make unwarranted assumptions in your life and that they lead to unhappiness? If you stop and think about it, your answer is probably yes, at least some of the time. And it often happens without us realizing it at all, either in the moment or even afterwards. Zen practice teaches us to pay attention, to look carefully and respond to what's really happening right now, instead of reaching from or reacting from our fixed views about things. When we start to see our unwarranted assumptions and our fixed views, we can start to change our thinking and so our experience of life. It's a story I want to tell you. There was a poor man who had nothing to feed his family with. So he went out into the forest hunting, hoping that he would find something. All of a sudden, he saw a rabbit come out of its little burrow. When the rabbit saw the man, he bolted and ran headlong into a fence post and dropped dead. The man was delighted. He went over, picked up the rabbit, took it home to feed his family. They had a wonderful meal, but they ate it all. So the next day, he still didn't have any food for his family, and he went out into the forest, back to the same place, and he went and stood by the fence post and waited. Obviously, he had made a ludicrous assumption, thinking that because something had happened once, it was going to happen again, and he would get the rabbit again. What makes it unwarranted? It's something, expecting something that's going to happen again because it's happened once, and by luck or by chance, and we don't really have any basis for assuming that it's going to happen again. Another way of putting that is past performance doesn't guarantee future outcomes. We've all heard that one. So an unwarranted assumption is an inference or a view that's not necessarily likely in reality. By contrast, a warranted assumption is something that we can take as correct based on careful, constant observation. Something like tomorrow morning, the sun is going to rise in what we call the east. And that's an assumption that I would say is warranted. If we examine the basis for our assumptions and fixed views, that is, whether there is a basis for things we believe to be true, then we often find that, in fact, the belief is not warranted. Sometimes we assume on such a deep level that we don't even see that the assumption is an assumption. We just see it as a truth or a certainty, and we don't even think to question it. In Buddhist thought, a view isn't just an abstract idea, but it is a charged interpretation of experience that shapes our thoughts, our emotions, and our actions. So we want to make sure that our view is right. Fixed views refer to what some person called rigid dogmatic beliefs or opinions that we cling to. The clinging or the attachment blocks our proper perception of things, and we don't always see things the way they really are. An everyday example of a fixed view is often found in groups. Imagine a Sangha, two people in the Sangha, Joseph and Mila, have to work out some problem, a scheduling problem, for example. Joseph thinks inside his head, my way of dealing with this is obviously the correct way. Mila isn't very smart, and so I'm sure that she's going to be wrong. This may or may not be true. Mila, on her side of things, has the thought, Joseph never listens, so any ideas he has aren't going to be useful or correct. Again, her thoughts may or may not be true. But both of them are clinging to preconceived opinions without really investigating whether those opinions are correct. And because of this, they will stop listening to each other for the most part, and they become more and more entrenched in their own respective views. The result is that both of them are going to feel frustration and probably resentment of the other, and ultimately, the problem they're trying to solve may well not get solved at all, or won't be solved in the best way it could be solved. So that's one of the sort of effects in real life of holding to fixed views. When I was trying to come up with examples of fixed views, I found a description of something that was called identity politics. I had to think about what did that really mean. And I think what is a decent description is if you have a certain set of characteristics, for example, you're white, you're Christian, you're not an immigrant, you believe in capitalism, and you agree with my way of thinking, then I will accept that you should be part of my group and that you're probably a good person, and I'll be inclined to work with you. On the other hand, if you don't have those characteristics, then I'm going to think that you are bad, your thinking is probably wrong, and I'm going to discredit you and challenge your thinking just because of who you are. That's what I refer to as identity politics. Holding those kinds of views is a pretty fixed view of what any individual person is or is not, and defining them by these kinds of characteristics most legal say is pretty flawed, but there are people who do that, and they hold to those fixed views and they operate in their life from that perspective. It doesn't always go very well. So these kinds of rigid views create division, anger, and suffering for everybody really who's involved, except the person who doesn't see it, and maybe they suffer later when they finally realize how sort of wrong their thinking has been. One of the important things to realize about fixed views is that they're often arise from, they're hidden. They're based on assumptions that we don't even recognize as assumptions. So we're unconsciously affected by them. We unconsciously hold on to them as being part of reality. There's a novel with the title Ishmael, where a human narrator who aspires to save the world answers an ad from a person named Ishmael, who turns out to be a wise Zen master-like talking gorilla. And the narrator becomes Ishmael's student. Having lived in a zoo and in a menagerie and in other forms of captivity, Ishmael has thought a lot about what it is to be captive. So he has some pretty good insights to share with this narrator student. The student realizes realizes and relates to Ishmael that he has this vague notion of having been somehow deceived in some way by societal teachings, but he can't really articulate what it is that makes him feel that way. And he just has this question, has this feeling that something's wrong with the way society teaches us to perceive life. Most of us would say, yeah, that sounds familiar, especially now that we're trying to study Zen. And over the course of the interaction between Ishmael and this student, the student comes to realize that he is essentially a captive of a cultural mythology that's built up over many, many, many centuries, eons in this society. And there are fundamental assumptions of Western society, including things like self-awareness, human language, and a culture that is deemed to be the right or the best culture. He eventually sees that many of these fundamental beliefs that underlie Western culture are essentially myths. That's what Ishmael leads him to see. That is, maybe say a myth, their background stories about the nature of the world and humankind that are unquestioned within the society. They're accepted and they're sort of swallowed whole, in a way, by humans as being true, and therefore being appropriate thoughts or understandings by which to run your life, live your life. And so that living our lives in conformity with these ideas or stories or myths has arisen because we believe them unquestionably, and probably many people don't even realize that they are myths or they're stories. They accept them as fact, as reality. For example, in Western society, we believe that, not to speak for all of you, but sort of on a general description of the thinking of Western society, we believe that humans are the pinnacle of evolution. We believe that the world was made for humans, and humans have the right, as well as sort of being destined to conquer and rule the world, and that plants, animals, and other aspects of nature are there for human use. We believe that we humans are moving closer and closer to creating a paradise, a perfect world. At least we used to believe that. And this arises as we increase our mastery over nature. And that's seen as, in the sort of traditional Judeo-Christian view, that's seen as the way it should be. And then when you look at it, though, you step back from it, and I think we're now at a stage where many of us say, isn't this exactly the thinking that's got us into the mess that we're now in, environmentally, societally, and how do we fix that? How do we rid ourselves of these underlying beliefs that are really wrong? So those are sort of at a cultural or a societal level. We're also taught a lot of views, sort of from babyhood as individual people. We're taught that there's a separate self, and that the me is alive inside. There's a me alive inside my body. We learn that each of us is a separate agent, and that we're acting independently, and we don't see that everything is fundamentally interconnected, even though that's now an accepted truth of science, physics. And I don't profess to understand physics in any way at all, but I do understand that quantum physics is showing us that our previous view of how the world is constructed, how energy interacts, and how matter is structured is wrong, is mistaken. It was a theory, and now we have more information, and we are realizing that it's actually not correct. Another belief that we learn as an individual human, we came into existence, and in doing so, we became a separate person, and that happened when I was born. And when I die, I'll cease to exist, and the universe will carry on without me. And we learn that life is finite, and that there's a beginning and an end to things. And one of the other things we talk about is believing that I'm the same me since my birth. Some of my characteristics were changed. I have white hair now, I have wrinkles, I can't do some of the things I used to be able to do, but I'm still the same person. I'm not changing in that fundamental way. We also learn that language and thought can completely encompass and describe our world and our experience. That's an ideal that we strive to. We want to use language, we want to use ideas, and we think that as long as we do it correctly, it will describe everything. We also unwittingly cultivate more personal fixed beliefs, like at the very individual level. Things like, I'm not smart, I'm not the proper person to do such a thing, I don't think fast enough, and so other people should make these decisions, I'm confused, I'm sloppy, and on the more confident side, maybe, things like, I've lived with you for a very long time, and so I know what you're going to say. I know what you think. You don't have to explain it all to me. I can just interrupt and we'll carry on, and I'll be carrying on in the same vein that you intended to carry on. And we realize through meditation that so many of these beliefs and assumptions are not correct. So looking at these beliefs that are inculcated in us from before we can even think really for ourselves as a conscious thinking, we live in a world of these unrecognized assumptions and cognitive understandings, and they're based on what we've been taught and on this sort of idea of past performance. Up till now, humans have mastered many things. Humans have done this and that with the world. We've managed to achieve. We've gone to the moon. So therefore, we must be on the right path. We must be doing things the right way. We must have the right idea of how to do things. But if we let go of these fixed ideas and assumptions, and instead we investigate the truth of the assumptions that we make, and we trade these fixed views for openness and attention, real attention to what's actually happening, how would that be? And where would it lead us? That's really what my understanding of Zen teaching, that's what we're trying to explore. Through practicing, I've come to realize that I do live in a world of fixed views, assumptions that seem like fact, and often I'm not actually seeing something that really can be taken as verifying that. We just accept it as true. We don't pick it apart and test it. And so often we're making unwarranted assumptions, and they don't correspond to one's actual experience of living life the way it actually is, assuming one can get the perspective that shows us that. It's also my experience that generally it makes it hard to live in harmony and with compassion for other people if we aren't aware of how much we operate from these fixed views. We have to sort of take them apart to be our best self, to be as compassionate and open as we can be for other people and for ourselves. So I'm starting to see that there's this other way of looking at things, not assuming, and instead trying to meticulously look without knowing that phrase. Find not knowing instead of thinking you know, or thinking that because you've always understood it this way, that must be right. So what we're looking for, or what it seems to me we're doing in practicing Zen, is that we're trying to live from a ground of not knowing or not assuming, and being open to possibilities, paying attention, and living in the now. You've heard him say that a million times, Now. That's what we need to focus on. That's what we need to understand. And that's the place from which we need to act. And do that instead of operating based on an idea of what might actually be happening or what is going to happen. Next, I want to talk a little bit about some sort of teachings of the Buddha about fixed views that inform all this sort of choice of direction when we're trying to practice. What did the Buddha say about fixed views? I think one of the most fundamental things is he said, where there's perception, there can be deception. There often is deception. You've heard us, and Kim's talked about it, and the story about Max, who loves to absorb this teaching about, often what we think we perceive as deception, and he'll say over and over and over again, when you see a snake on the road, look again. It might just be a coil of rope. It's one of the teachings that the Buddha gave, but it's interesting to see how, for him, it's like this thing that he can see, he can understand, and when he says it to us, it certainly makes me say, yeah, that's a good perspective. Not always about concrete things, but other things too. And in preparing for this talk, I read some of the writings of Thich Nhat Hanh on the teachings of the Buddha. And he has said that perceptions or thoughts always have what he calls a mark. And sometimes the mark or the appearance is illusory. I think that what he's saying is that we think that what we see, or the word we use, or the label that we use is real and is accurate, and that's not necessarily the case. We've not necessarily seen deeply enough into something that we think we understand. Buddha also taught that most of our perceptions are erroneous, and maybe that's another way of saying the same thing, and that attachment to incorrect fixed views, whether about ourselves, about the world, about any ultimate truth, creates suffering and obstructs us from being able to go down the path of awakening. Again, reading in Thich Nhat Hanh, he pointed out that perception requires both a perceiver and an object of perception, and that these are not separate. He says that rather they happen together, each exists simultaneously, each within the other. And that's a hard thing to wrap your mind around, but I think that's what we start to see. That's nothing exists on its own side of things. Nothing exists separately. There was a quote from his writing that I thought was quite helpful. It's a little bit long, but I'm going to read it. It's from the chapter in the book on Teachings of the Buddha, the chapter called Right View. So he wrote, "The source of our perception, our way of seeing, lies in our store consciousness. If 10 people look at a cloud, there will be 10 different perceptions of that cloud. Whether it is perceived as a dog, a hammer, or a coat depends on the perceiver's mind, on their senses, their sadness, their memories, their anger. Perceptions carry with them all the errors of subjectivity. Then, when we praise, blame, condemn, or complain, depending on our perceptions, then we do that. We do these things based on our own subjective perceptions. But our perceptions are made of our afflictions, craving, anger, ignorance, wrong views, and prejudice. Whether we are happy or we suffer depends largely on our perceptions. It's important to look deeply at our perceptions and know their source." And a little bit later on, he continues, "We have to look deeply into our perceptions in order to become free of them. Then, what has become a perception, what has been a perception becomes an insight, a realization of the path. This is neither perception nor non-perception. It is a clear vision, seeing things as they are." I hope that's helpful. It helped me. I could never say that myself, but of course I'm not pick that up. So what do we take from this? We must be very attentive and ask ourselves whether we can be sure that our perceptions are valid. In other words, pay attention. I've heard Kim say that a million times. It's a good, succinct way of saying all this, the words I've just been saying for minutes and minutes. Fixed views that are wrong are incomplete and take us outside intimacy of the present moment. And Thich Nhat Hanh has said that to practice is to go beyond mere ideas so that you can arrive at the suchness of things. I'm not going to try to define suchness, but it's part of realization, is my understanding. The Buddha also emphasized that not holding to fixed views is very important. Freedom comes from letting go of attachment to opinions and rigid beliefs, i.e. fixed views. Buddhist practice helps to loosen the rigid beliefs that we hold on to, and by cultivating awareness, openness, compassion, and direct experience of reality. Ultimately, all views are incorrect because they are a verbal picture or painting of reality. They're not reality itself. I think that's why we often talk about language gets in the way, but it's the only way we have of communicating for the most part. So before relying on any view, we should at least investigate whether or not it's an accurate map of reality. It's also important not to throw out all of the Buddhist teachings on the basis that they too are fixed views. For example, the teachings that the teaching of impermanence, the teaching of non-separation, the teaching of the inevitability of death and karma, the preciousness of human life. All of these are fundamental to living, or all of these realizations are fundamental to living a bodhisattva life. And in Zen, we have to begin with faith in these teachings of the Buddha, because most of us aren't instantly going to realize them as truths for ourselves. You have to spend a lot of time looking at that to actually have that full realization, not as a learned fact, but as an insight. For some reason, it seemed important to me to say that there's something mysterious about life, and not everything can be understood. And I don't think we should think that we can understand everything, but we can at least try to let go of views that don't really have a basis in reality, that we haven't really seen to be true, and that then we might come closer to appreciating how mysterious our life is. Should we stop there? So I guess one can say that practicing Zen, it starts to reveal that all our views and assumptions aren't necessarily warranted. And I'm not saying that I've seen to the bottom of this, but I do think I'm beginning to have an inkling. And so it's worth pursuing and trying harder and harder to be open and experiencing without thinking I know. I think that will lead me and other people to a happier place. Maybe it'll let me let go of some of my self-judgments that are not very helpful. Maybe it will lead me to be able to understand other people better, and also to know how best to act for the benefit of everybody, not just myself, not just my group. So to conclude, what is living a spiritual life. It's being sincere and being ardent, I think, in trying to see what the Buddhist teachings hold out for us. Not to kid ourselves about how much we understand or how much we've seen, but not to give up. But as a fundamental starting point, to try to identify what aren't necessarily correct views, and to identify for ourselves what are the fixed views that we are erroneously operating under. So practicing Zen doesn't mean don't think, but it does mean use your thinking to help you have a bigger realization. There's lots of times where we have to think. We build bridges, we cook something. Thinking is great in those circumstances, but thinking doesn't give us the answer to everything. One of the, perhaps, I was talking about the mystery of life. Some people think of that as God. And one of the sayings that we've heard Alan Watts to have said is, what's spiritual life, what's practice? It's don't think about God when you're peeling the potatoes, just peel the potatoes, which I understand to mean don't think you know, just look at what's happening right now, engage it, and then learn from that. Thank you.